All right, we're going to now move into the last portion of the doctrine dimension. So we had kind of a lot of core concepts to go over. That's why we have so many different parts to this lecture. But we've come to the end, or we've come to the last slide. So the last couple things we're going to talk about for doctrine. The first one is soteriology. And if you remember from our discussion in Hinduism, remember this is sort of what is the main problem for humanity in this tradition, right? What are human beings' main problem? And for Buddhism, it is ignorance and attachment. And these two, of course, are very closely connected to each other. So remember that the title the Buddha means someone who has awakened, right? Someone who woke up. That implies that everyone else, right, which is the vast majority of all of us, because most of us are not Buddhas yet, maybe only yet, we are asleep, right? That if we are not Buddhas, we have not awoken, we have not woken up. So we are asleep. And in Buddhism, what this means is that we live in ignorance, or we live in delusion of what the world is really like. And a lot of that has to do with the Four Noble Truths that we just talked about, right? Which is that the world is actually, or our lives are full of suffering, but they're full of suffering because of our attachment. And we become attached to things because we don't see the world for the way it really is. Right? We pretend that things last forever. We pretend that things are permanent instead of accepting that everything in this world, everything in life is constantly changing. So because we are ignorant of that fact, or sort of delusional about that fact, we become attached to things, we cling to things, therefore we end up suffering. So our ignorance is what leads to our attachment, right? Our ignorance of the true nature of the world, which is that everything is impermanent, right? And if we come to accept that, then we won't become attached to things. So the main problem is our ignorance in terms of the true nature of reality and the resulting attachments that come from that, right? We become attached to things, people, situations that are good for us, and we simply willfully forget that whatever that is that's good for us is going to end, right? That situation, that person, that thing in our life that's good, we just decide to forget that that's going to change, right? That that's not always going to be there. We, expect it to always be there. We think it's always going to be there. And then when it's not, we suffer. So through the path of Buddhism, through the Four Noble Truths, and as we'll see, the Eightfold Noble Path, we learn to rid ourselves of this ignorance and thereby rid ourselves of this attachment. So that's what the main problem is for humanity in Buddhism. The next teaching that I have here, the next bulletin point here, are the three gems. And the idea in Buddhism is that this is not an easy worldview to adopt, right? It's not simple, or it's not easy to say, yeah, everything changes. Therefore, everything that good comes into your life, you should remember that that's going to end, right? And the fact that there is no external source of help for you, right? As at least talking about Theravadan Buddhism, right? It takes a lot of hard work to overcome our ignorance and overcome our attachment, and we have to do that ourselves. We have to put in that hard work. And we'll see the Eightfold Path shows us how to accomplish that hard work, but it could take an entire lifetime. It could take multiple lifetimes. So this is rather a difficult worldview to adopt, right? This is not an easy path to embark upon. It's not easy to see the world for what it truly is. That's why most of us live in delusion. That's why most of us are still asleep, right? It's easier to just go through, attachment after attachment and then suffer. Maybe ultimately, of course, it's better to not suffer, but it's easier for us to just sort of go with our natural reaction, which is to become attached to things, to cling to things, and then later suffer the consequences. So the idea of the three gems in Buddhism is that you take refuge in the three gems. That as your path becomes difficult, as you need guidance and you need support and you need inspiration, there are 3 places that you can look to. There are 3 gems that will give you that solace and inspiration. And those are the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. So the Buddha is a gem in terms of his teachings and his example. So remember, Siddhartha Gautama, for most Buddhists, or I shouldn't say for most Buddhists, but for many Buddhists, especially Theravadan Buddhists, Siddhartha Gautama was a human being. There was nothing special about him other than the fact that he became a Buddha, right? He was able to achieve enlightenment. So his example is inspirational for Buddhists, right? What he did, I can do that too. If he was able to accomplish it, then I can accomplish it too. Especially looking at his past, right? He went from an incredibly wealthy individual, right? He had everything, and he was able to overcome his attachments to those things, and he was able to become enlightened. So I can take refuge in the Buddha in terms of being inspired by his example, right? I want to accomplish what he accomplished, and if he can do it, I can do it. I can also take refuge in his teachings. And we're going to talk about the Buddhist scriptures in a minute. But Siddhartha Gautama taught for many, many years. And the lessons that he gave are recorded in the Buddhist scriptures. So when I need guidance, when I need solace, I can look to his words. I can look to his teachings that are recorded in the Buddhist scriptures. And those can help me in my path, right? Those can help me as I move along the path towards nirvana. The second one here is the Dharma. And the Dharma, we've already heard this term before. We heard it in the context of Hinduism. And in Hinduism, Dharma has a close connection to ethics, right? It's your it's the selfless action, it's your religious duty or your religious responsibility. So it has to do with how you behave towards others. In Buddhism, how you behave towards others or how you act in the world really covers a lot of what Buddhism is. So in Buddhism, Dharma, the word Dharma refers more to, we could say, the body of Buddhist teachings. So when I learn about the Dharma, I'm learning about Buddhism in general, Buddhist teachings, Buddhist doctrine. So I can take refuge in the Dharma by reading lots of different Buddhist teachings, by learning from a Buddhist monk or nun, him or herself. So as I move farther in my path, I need to meditate, reflect on these doctrines, these writings, whether it's a written teaching, learning directly from an individual. But I take refuge in the Dharma by learning more and more about Buddhism, more about Buddhist doctrines and Buddhist teachings, so that I can move further in my path, right? To understand the true nature of the world, the true nature of myself. And you'll see this reflected if you go to a Buddhist monastery or Buddhist temple. When someone gives a teaching, if you go to a church or something, it's called a sermon. If you go to a Buddhist temple, it's called a Dharma talk. So different, teachers, monks, and nuns give Dharma talks because they're talking about the Dharma. And then the third gem here is the Sangha. And the Sangha is really the community of Buddhist monks and nuns. So that could refer to a local community of monks and nuns if someone lives near a Buddhist temple or a monastery. It can also be used to refer to sort of the worldwide community of Buddhist monks and nuns. But you take refuge in the Sangha because really they are a great resource for Buddhists, right? Even if I'm a householder, I'm somebody who's not living a lifetime as a monk or a nun. I have a family and a job and I live in the world. I respect the example of those who have chosen to become monks or nuns, right? I greatly praise them for that. I respect them for that. It's maybe not appropriate in my lifetime, but seeing them, interacting with them, one, it gives me inspiration, right? That maybe in a future lifetime, I will be able to dedicate my life to overcoming suffering and achieving enlightenment. And they are also your local experts and your local teachers because they have dedicated their lives to this teaching and to this practice. They are, sort of understood to be much further along in this path, or many of them can be much further along in this path. So they have lessons to teach me. Right? So I want to go to my local temple so that I can learn from them. They can teach me about Buddhist doctrine. They can help me in my meditation because they do that so much. And they can help explain these doctrines to me and help me in my path as well. They're also a gem, they're also a source of refuge because helping my local Sangha is a way of earning good karma. It is a way of helping me in my path. So as we'll see when we get to the society dimension, Buddhist monks and nuns, they're individuals who have given up, having a family and a job because they want to dedicate themselves fully to this path. So they live off of the generosity, the hospitality of others, right? The people in the community give them food, give them what they need to survive. So I can take refuge in the Sangha because if I'm not a Buddhist monk or a nun, I can help my local monks and nuns. I can give them food. I can help them out, give my time and my effort to them to help take care of them because I appreciate what they're doing, right? I respect the path that they've chosen. So those are the three gems. So in Buddhism, you take refuge in the three gems. You look to these three sources of inspiration and guidance as you move further along in your path. And then the last thing that I have here are just a little bit about Buddhist scriptures. So Buddhism does have, we could say, sacred or important texts, but it's not just one. So similar to Hinduism, there's not like a Buddhist Bible. Right? There's not a single text that sort of everyone in Buddhism looks to, and that's the core text. There are lots of different important texts in Buddhism. The first category that I have here are called the Tripitaka. And the word Tripitaka is Pali for three baskets. And that refers to these three categories of literature that you can see underneath here. The suttas, or oftentimes called sutras, the Abhidhamma, and the Vinaya. So those are the Tripitaka. Those are the three baskets. And really this term refers to, several hundred years after the death of the Buddha, the first Buddhist scriptures were gathered together into these texts. And sort of the story goes that these monks were, they wanted to gather together and organize these scriptures. So they put them into basically like three piles or three baskets. So the sutras, the Abhidhamma, and the Vinaya, they have different kind of content. So the first category is the sutta or sutra. A lot of times you hear it written see it written as sutras with an R. And these are teachings by Siddhartha Gautama. So remember, Siddhartha Gautama taught for many, many years after he became enlightened. He did not write down any of his own teaching. So it's important to know the sutras are not written by Siddhartha Gautama, but his disciples, his students, memorized what he said. Many of them wrote down what he said. And, over the course of several generations, his teachings were gathered together, collected, and put into a body of texts. So there are many of these teachings that are said to be or believed to be the actual words of Siddhartha Gautama, the teachings that he gave during his life. The second category of literature are the Abhidhammas or Abhidharmas. And these are basically philosophical meditations on the sutras. So, for a very long time, Buddhist scholars, monks, and nuns have read the sutras. So they've read the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama and then written about how they understand them, right? They've written interpretations of those teachings. So that's what the Abhidhammas are. They are philosophical meditations on the original teachings of Siddhartha Gautama. And then the third category is the Vinaya. And the Vinaya is really, it is the rules that monks or nuns have to follow. So if you want to become a Buddhist monk or a nun, it's a rather strict lifestyle. There are lots of rules and guidelines for how you have to live your life, what the daily practices are, the things that you have to give up and the things that you have to do. So that's what the Vinaya is. It's basically the sort of list of rules or literature, writings about what the life of a Buddhist monk or nun is going to look like. So that's the Tripitaka. And for the most part, the Tripitaka is most important to Theravadan Buddhists. So Theravadan Buddhists tend to focus on the Tripitaka, which are it's also called the Pali Canon or the Pali texts. And these are the earliest writings that we have about Buddhism. So they sort of look to this first generation of literature, and you can see that goes well with their understanding that they are the way of the elders. They are the more traditional form of Buddhism. Mahayana Buddhism, however, usually looks more to a text called the Lotus Sutra. And the Lotus Sutra is a later Buddhist writing, although the content of the Lotus Sutra also has teachings by Siddhartha Gautama. So there's sort of different understandings that these texts are also original to Siddhartha Gautama. But the Lotus Sutra is one text. It is itself a compilation of different types of writings, different teachings by different Buddhist monks, different stories about Buddhism. But that text is mainly used by Mahayana Buddhists. Mahayana Buddhists don't tend to look to the Tripitaka as closely. Doesn't mean that they don't consider it legitimate. They absolutely do, but they tend to focus on the teachings of the Lotus Sutra more. Those tend to be more central to Mahayana Buddhism because it has many of the differences or many of the teachings that we talked about in terms of that emphasis on compassion, teachings about the bodhisattvas, things like that. So that's more their core text. But it would not be uncommon for a Theravadan Buddhist to also read the Lotus Sutra, or a Mahayana Buddhist to also read the Pali text. It's just sort of the body of literature that is most central to those teachings. Okay, so that's all we have for doctrine. So we finally came to an end of that category or that dimension. And next we're going to move on to ritual.